Hey guys, so today I want to talk to you about the 4 stages of painting. These stages are the ones at least I use, and I know that other artists probably use a different method than I do, but these are what have been working for me so far, and hopefully they can help you as well. Some of these parts do overlap from time to time, but the overall arching idea is that as you progress in your specific painting, you will be in one of these stages if you replicate my method. My style of painting goes for realism, and so these 4 parts help block in a certain time frame to see how I'm progressing, so that I can evaluate my position on whether I will be ready to move on to the next stage. This is true especially for large-scale projects that I like to do that consume dozens of hours, and organizing my time into particular stages helps me to see the paintings from a more broad scale, and that is an important thing to do if you're detail-oriented and want to organize your creativity, which at times can be pretty scattered both on canvas and in your mind. Okay, so the first stage. This one is of course the easiest and fastest, which is the underpainting. All you really do is spread some thin layer of paint onto the canvas to establish a color that will help unify the subsequent colors. I use acrylic for this because it dries fast and I can move on to the later stages without any needless waiting. Underpainting is important because first off, it affects the colors that you layer on top of it. If you apply thin layers of paint over the underpainting, this will help unify the colors together so that they will still have a similar undertone. But here's the thing, if you keep stacking more and more layers of certain color, then that color will stand out a lot more and become more vivid or bright. You can use this as an excellent technique for creating bright colors that will emerge a lot more strongly from the rest of the painting, so that the background colors will continue to be unified by the underpainting. So this way you can have certain sections of the painting that serve as the backdrop. Meanwhile, the areas you want to showcase and highlight, you can escape the gravity of the underpainting by continuing to layer more and more color. Another thing about underpainting is also doing a sketch of the subject you want to paint. Me personally, I don't do it because I rely a lot on the reference photo and the grid pattern that I use, but sketching is also part of this initial process, and it's optional so that it's entirely up to you. Also, I believe that sketching restricts my freedom of movement on the canvas, because when you draw something, you're already establishing lots of detail at an early stage, and it forces you to tighten up your brushing way too early. But hey, I've seen other artists do it and create some really great paintings, but again, that's entirely up to you. I like to have as much freedom and range of motion as possible in these early stages. So now let's move on to the next stage. The second stage of painting that I use is gridding. After the underpainting has dried up, I then establish a 16 square grid on the canvas that matches the reference photograph that I'll be using. Depending on the type of painting that you're doing, this can actually take quite some time. The easiest occasion for this stage is when I paint a typical landscape, where the 4x4 grid is all I need to get a good idea of where the subject matter is going to be painted. However, the big jump in difficulty and learning curve is when I use multiple reference photos. For example, in my portrait painting where I painted the 2 dogs in Renaissance outfits. In this situation, I had to use 4 different reference photos, and so I had to measure out 4 separate grids on the canvas. I had to do some math and get some proportions on how the dog's head is going to fit properly inside their costume. I had to color code the grids as well, so that the grid for the clothing would be a light yellow and the grid for the dog's heads would be light blue. I had to overlap these grids as well, and so this really complicated things. So in addition to painting something difficult, there is some math and measurement involved that I have to overcome. Grids can also be narrowed down. With most of my portraits, in addition to the 4x4 grid, I measure out a smaller grid inside the box where the face is, so that I can match the face as accurately as possible. Grids, of course, are entirely optional, but using these, for me at least, are essential because I tend to be bad at estimating things from my own intuition. But the second stage of painting helps establish a great platform. I'd like to think that a painting is like a construction project, the underpainting being the foundation and the grid pattern being the scaffolding. So now, let's move on to the third stage. So, the third stage, and probably the longest and most difficult, is the blocking stage. The reason why it's the longest is because this blocking stage has its own subsections of stages. These time frames can overlap, and within this stage I alternate between various painting methods. So the first part of this stage is starting to match the main colors and sections of the reference photo onto the canvas. In this part, I evaluate the light and dark parts of the photo and everything in between, and establish the proper color values onto the canvas. Also, at the same time, I heavily rely on the grid patterns on where to lay out the colors and shadows, measuring the distance between the reference lines on the grid. I have a more in-depth video about measuring and using the reference grid in the description below if you want to get a further understanding of how to use a grid pattern more effectively. This blocking in stage has both large scale and small scale elements to it. You're going to first establish the larger clusters of color and shadow, and then work your way to the smaller chunks of detail. Also, keep in mind that at the beginning of the stage, make sure to use less intense colors because you'll be adding more later. And plus, the background colors are typically not going to be as vivid as the ones closer to the front. Okay, once you get the main parts of the painting established, getting the smaller parts is the next part of this third stage. This will most likely take up most of your time during the painting, especially if there's a lot of detail involved. The reason why this stage is so difficult is because not only are you matching what's on the photo onto the canvas, but you're also at the same time trying to find out the color values and properly adding the right shading and lighting. So you're doing multiple things at once: measuring, shading, highlighting, and layering. Also in this stage, you will need to determine what parts need more color layers and which parts you can add thinner layers so that they can blend in more to the background and be anchored by the underpainting. Another part of the stage, which you can do at any time, is blending. When I blend, I use a very soft brush, and it doesn't matter which one it is, as long as the bristles are soft and preferably the brush is round shaped. And when I talk about blending, I mean not only blending the colors, but also blending the edges. Me personally, I don't like having any sharp edges in anything I paint, so even if there's an edge of, say, like a building up against the sky, I would very gently blend those edges together with a soft brush. But also, keep in mind not to overdo it, otherwise it would turn out too blurry. The fourth and final stage is the refining stage. Once you overcome the hurdle of the previous stage, you should have a much easier time with this one, as most of the hard work is over. I like the stage not only because you finally see your hard work paid off, but also you get to see the final details of your work. Once you get all the basic detail on the canvas and have every square inch covered, this is when you can continue adding the final layers of paint. The areas that need to be highlighted can finally have that last coat of color that would really make it radiate. At this point, you'll be relying less and less on the grid pattern because if you did everything correctly, your painting should be pretty well established, and all you need to do now is sharpen and polish up everything. Depending on how much more you want to add, you could keep going with adding more refined textures on your portraits or landscapes. You can make minor adjustments to any areas you see. You can evaluate how the contrast looks overall and determine whether you need to go back and adjust the values. All those small details you can finally add in this stage, and this stage can take quite a long time depending on what you're painting. But even so, I'd say it's still easy because all the hard work of measuring and matching is over. I would say the only hard part about this stage is if you actually do have to correct any mistakes and having to erase some of that detail and do it all over again. It is kind of disappointing to see some of that hard work being smeared over, but the end result is worth it. So once I finish the stage of the painting, I would step back and see if there are any small parts that I still need to go over that I may have accidentally missed. If there's nothing left to be done, I would usually sign the painting and call it finished. So these are the 4 stages of painting. Mind you, some of these stages are going to be more difficult than others, but overcoming them and thinking about the end result is what can keep you motivated. Anyways, I hope that you have learned something valuable from this video. And if you did, please hit the thumbs up, leave a comment, and if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel for more tutorials and time-lapse videos, which I'm working really hard on right now. So anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.